So we're going almost in alphabetical order. On my very right will be Dr. Sarah Burke, who is one of the female entrepreneurs, most respected female entrepreneurs in Ireland. She's CEO and co-founder of SkyTech. She is works, almost on a daily basis with the ESA, and we're very proud of Sarah as a role model of what she does in Ireland in terms of high tech and actually building the SkyTech brand. Hugely pleased to have Mark Carrel-Billiard with us. Mark flew in from San Francisco yesterday. Very bumpy flight, actually. JC, I think if ICHEC could really look at actually the turbulence and figure out the routes, so you can avoid the turbulence, I'd say Mark would be happy with that.
To drive the plane better, probably.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mark is a fellow Frenchman of JC, but Mark is one of the coolest jobs in the world. He's the global managing director of Accenture Labs, and I'm really envious. I used to have one of the best labs or jobs in the world, but I think your job is even better. And Mark's going to be talking to us about some of the key trends that he's seeing and what he and Accenture are seeing in high performance computing. Next, Leo actually is Leo Clancy, alphabetical order. Leo Clancy is one of the top executives in IDA, somebody who was deep in industry, spent 17 years in the telecommunications industry, and is a huge advocate, a brilliant ambassador for Ireland in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. So great to have you here. JC needs no introduction, but actually spent his formative years actually at Edinburgh, but has been on a journey here in Ireland where he's had a vision. He's demonstrated, delivered a lot of hard work and huge resilience. It's like a swan that everything looks beautiful, on the outside, but underneath, there was an awful lot of paddling and toing and froing. I remember Dennis and I had several calls over the years in terms of how do we navigate and how should we navigate the politics and the finance and so JC needs no introduction. Mark Parsons, really delighted that you're here. He's a distinguished professor, did a lot of earlier work, PhD at CERN. Is now a professor at Edinburgh, director of EPCC, and also the associate dean for e-research. And finally, Isabella, who's responsible for the wonderful weather that we have to mark the celebration. She's deputy director of computing at the European Medium Range Centre just outside Reading, and you're really one of the most impressive facilities that you can visit. And in terms of thinking of usage, Michael Schraves at MIT says innovation is innovators. It's not innovation. It's not innovators innovating. It's customers adopting. And I think the number of customers that are using your facilities, Isabella, is truly amazing. And of course, Roberto Viola, Director or Dr. Viola needs no introduction, and I think has really set the scene. So we'll get kicked off, and maybe to start with the panelists, and start with you, Sarah, just to think about your interest in high performance computing and examples where you might have seen competitiveness delivered through high performance computing.
Okay. Hi. As Chief Executive of SkyTech, I feel I've been through quite a few kind of technical revolutions. The company started during the kind of dot-com boom. We went as a little company and were able to introduce to ESA a very disruptive innovation that would enable them to replace the need for paper-based technical manuals on board the space station. I think our technology, we beat off competition from kind of some of the leading companies in the US. In 2003, we presented to all the partners of the International Space Station, and they selected the SkyTech system as being far superior to anything that was available in the marketplace. And the reason I make that point is I feel that at that time was the dot-com revolution, and I feel that for a small company today, there's those opportunities with high-performance computing. Because since our technology went on board the International Space Station in 2005, I've seen, smart computers, I've seen augmented reality, I've seen social media, and every time you see these revolutions, and now you have the high-performance big data experience, you know that it does bring fundamental changes, not only to a business, but also to society as a whole. In terms of the interest that we as a company have, we do a lot of work in space, and we're heavily involved now in Earth observation and security. And I mean, for those of you who maybe aren't convinced about high performance computing, I think this is probably an easier sell because you're all here this evening. But some of you may not know that if you take the Irish water, say for example, into consideration, Ireland is the second biggest company, or second biggest country in Europe. So we've been working with the Irish Naval Services to try and bring, instead of kind of getting more ships, the concept was, well, let's bring technology, let's protect and secure Irish waters using technology. So we've been able, through clever data analytics, et cetera, to be able to develop an entirely new system for the Navy that will enable them to better predict potentially suspicious vessels, et cetera. So that's a huge innovation for Ireland. And the other, I think, really good example is we work an awful lot with the emergency services. And I was speaking with somebody there recently, and I think many of us are quite familiar around this time of the year. We get the first floods. Unfortunately, people from Cork, it always tends to start in Cork or around there. And but what somebody said to me, which I thought was really interesting, is with the high performance computing now, it's actually, at the moment when we listen to the weather, it's going to flood in Cork, but now with high performance computing and all the Sentinel satellites and all the kind of major innovations that are going on, it is going to be possible very soon for them to say, well, it's going to flood in Main Street in Cork or Princess Street in Cork. Now, the importance of that to the emergency services is, as somebody said to me, is that if you can get the high velocity pumps to specific areas, then you potentially prevent the big flooding disasters that we've seen in Ireland. So I think that that's where, it's not about high performance, it's what the computers can actually do and how they can actually bring about fundamental change. The final one, before I kind of go on too long, is the whole idea of water. The idea that now, using Earth observation and sensors, somebody doesn't have to go around testing the water around the country. You can have your remote sensors, you can have your Earth observation data, and very quickly, now it should be easier to prevent water contamination, and when it does happen, there should be a faster speed of response. So that's kind of, I suppose, my area of interest. And I suppose I should mention that in this kind of revolution, I see myself now a little bit building the shovels this time around for the gold rush, because in association with ICHEC, we've been awarded a contract with the European Space Agency to develop the European Data Validation Centre. And what that is, it's going to be a repository where scientists, many of you in the room today, can test the validity and calibration of their data. So I think that that's a really good example of how Ireland, I feel, can compete in terms of picking a niche market where we can, using the kind of technical kind of software, kind of web portal data analytics skills of SkyTech in association with the computer power of ICHEC, and bring the two of them together and develop a kind of a niche market where Ireland, will be the centre for Europe for scientists in Earth observation. So I'm finished now. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Sarah, and I think a great example of academic sort of industry collaboration that's leading to success, and that's one of the areas that we want to explore in the panel. I did want to mention that Sarah's an accountant. It just goes to show that not all accountants have a charisma bypass at birth. So next, Mark, and I'm going to come to you later to talk about sort of the trends, but if you could just, from an Accenture standpoint, evidence that you see that high performance computing leads to competitiveness.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure, and very pleased to be here. In fact, I was at our innovation center, so we just opened last year an innovation center, which is nearby, and I have one of my labs that specializes in artificial intelligence, a lot of machine learning work that we're doing over there, as well as natural language processing, and obviously, we need a lot of computing power there. And so for people that don't know much about Accenture, it's a big firm, obviously. We're close to 400,000 people. And we've been doing research and development for 30 years. Maybe not very well known because we don't publicize so much about it. And the thing which is interesting is that the research that we're doing is really what we call applied research. So we don't do any research activity that is not applicable to a business challenge from a client or something that is going to be important that we have to solve, okay? So we have 7 labs today in the world, and they all specialize in different areas. But over 30 years of research and development, we've been always leveraging high-performance computing, okay? And we had different forms, shapes of supercomputers, okay? Today, what we see in terms of trends is that clearly, if you look at the cloud environment that we can leverage, whether we talk about AWS, Azure, and some others, this is what we see our clients are doing, and this is also what we're doing, okay? You look at, in terms of the revenue spent on cloud and high-performance computing in the last few years, I mean, we're close to the $50 billion. That means that there's a real shift on leveraging, basically, and connecting. I love very much the discussion that the Director General talked about it, the fact that this is going to be really a network of supercomputers or cloud, everything, they're going to be working together collectively, I mean, to be able to solve the bigger problems. But what's interesting also is that we see that, again, I mean, in the labs, I mean, we're covering, I mean, many aspects of, I mentioned machine learning, so we have a specialized also in cybersecurity. We're doing that also related to what we call the immersive experience, so talking about augmented reality, mixed reality today that combines basically holographic representation with reality of what you see today. What you see is that all this and more will require more computing power, and this is something that we're leveraging. In terms of the trends, that what we see is clearly, I mean, I mentioned the clouds, but I think we're moving also a lot to graphical process unit. So we're building basically a partnership with companies like NVIDIA to work basically in leveraging basically some of their chips and to be able basically to do massive parallelism for a cheaper price. I mean, it's just starting to be very cheap. And then I'll explain also that I think we're moving the boundaries. We believe that quantum computing is going to be a big actor for also high-performance computing, and this is the direction that we're taking also. So a couple of examples, as Sarah mentioned. High-performance computing for me is like, and that's what we discussed with my researchers, is that we believe that we can make impact in the society, in the world. Okay, so it's not only solving like business challenges, but solving like societal issues, So we've been working in precision agriculture, for example, in Asia, to try to study deforestation and how basically we can survey 100,000 of trees and everything and figure out exactly if there's possibility of disease and everything using drones, all IoT sensors and everything, to be able to swallow petabytes of data and be able basically to harvest this data and see what we can do and what we can find there. So precision agriculture is obviously something which is very well suited for high-performance computing. We're talking about machine learning. There's much more we're doing in predictive monitoring. The machine learning and all the artificial intelligence that we're doing in our group applies to every lab. So when I talk about cybersecurity, obviously cybersecurity is leveraging a lot of machine learning. And there also, you need a lot of high-performance computing. Here, we don't use much cloud, but we are really geared into GPUs type of technologies. But I could go on and on. So in summary, okay, I think high-performance computing has been different shape and forms. Today, again, I think it's very much into cloud and GPUs. We're leveraging that across all our labs, and we have a very concrete example that not only solve business challenges, but also address societal problems.
Great, Mark. Maybe JC, you could share quickly your favorite example of ICHEC in terms of enabling competitive advantage.
Absolutely. So I would like to take on to follow on from Mark. First of all, I was impressed by the level of overlap in terms of interest. So I don't know if that means that we'll be competitors in years to come or partners. I hope it is the latter, of course. But to go back to GPU, actually, it's worth noting that ICHEC was, I believe, the 6th center in the world to be awarded the status of CUDA Research Center. And what this meant in practice is that very shortly we gained a worldwide award called the HPC Wire Award for the most innovative use of HPC in the financial services. Now, it's working for a big UK multi-billion-dollar in the city in London, and we basically shortened the time windows they had for risk assessment from about 4 minutes to about a second, right? So I think in terms of competitiveness, in terms of return on investment and impact, it is always extremely difficult to obtain this kind of data from companies because they're a bit paranoid about their competitors, trying to raise their game, to match them or exceed them. But there is no doubt to me that if a major financial services institution are able to carry out what took 4 minutes to only a second in a time-critical context, derives very significant benefits out of it. I could use similar examples in the medical devices sector. So, for example, the award which I brought, I have to say, which is on the table here, from ICHEC last Friday, we shortened actually the whole processing of these blood platelets from 24-hour process to only 4 minutes, right? And again, this resulted in our software bringing attention from a company, Becton Dickinson & Company, looking at the applicability of porting that particular software onto some of their prototypes. So I think these are concrete examples of impact, in my opinion.
Great. Thanks, JC. And I was afraid JC was going to use that example, but now that I no longer work for Intel, I don't break out an allergic reaction when you mentioned the CUDA Competency Centre. No, it's fantastic, fantastic contribution. I know, Roberto, you have sort of shared comments. Was there anything that you've seen that you particularly, even the potential, obviously, I know you mentioned the precision healthcare, but for Europe, is there a particular area where you either have seen competitive advantage or there's a real opportunity for us to capitalise on high-performance computing?
Well, I have many, many examples. Let me pick up 2 examples from the commercial world where you would not expect. The first one is a small company which is called Menarini, works on F1 cars and does the chassis. Basically, this company does everything on a computer, so it doesn't print the chassis anymore, and allows the F1 pilots to test the chassis on a computer simulation on every circuit that they digitize, the real circuits, so they can test the reactions, the personalized reaction of the pilot, and then when actually the test is finished, then they arrive to the production stage. So the production stage of the chassis is only 5% of the whole production cycle. Everything else is on a computer. The other example is a very large company which does blades for windmills, for wind power systems. And basically, the problem there is to do very large blades. And basically, they have one possibility, which is a wind tunnel, so they have to do a smaller model, go to the wind tunnel, test it, it's very expensive. And the other one is to use supercomputers and to model the blade and the turbulence around the blade, By the way, the true supercomputing design, the next generation of aircraft should be able to compensate. That's what is promised. Already the 787 has some of this feature, but not very much those. But the next generation will allow us to play cards even in very high winds. But coming back to the blades, so they can actually skip the wind tunnels, skip all this, and go directly to the production of very large blades, which could be unthinkable without a supercomputer.
Okay, great, Roberto. I'll turn to you, Isabella, next, and a completely unscripted question. How could you move from the beautiful city of Graz to Reading? Please.
The answer is easy. I moved for the food and the weather.
So I know you've had a distinguished career in Graz, a really truly beautiful city. What either at Graz or in Reading at the medium range forecasting center, competitiveness. How has that helped in terms of competitiveness? Obviously, we get better forecasts, and again, thanks for the weather. But you could potentially share a couple of examples.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I start with Graz, where I got into high-performance computing, and I won't tell you how many years that is ago. And I got interested in the technology, which was kind of computers that were difficult to program, vector computers at the time. And people used Fortran. It hasn't changed much. People are using Fortran, and computers are still difficult to program. But I got also interested in what you could do that you couldn't do before. And I worked with civil engineers and mechanical and electrical engineers. I worked as a service provider, so I was providing support and services for science and technology, and I'm doing the same at the European Weather Center, ECMWF, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecast. So it's not difficult to explain why you need supercomputers for weather forecasting. And if you think back, von Neumann and the first computer, they envisaged that an application area for these new innovative tools they thought about would be climate and weather prediction. The weather prediction is a nice example because one constraint that we have is time to solution. It doesn't make sense to have the weather prediction of tomorrow's weather in a week's time. The organization I work for is an international organization, and it's a prime example for collaboration in Europe in a very successful way. Countries in Europe at the time, and I was in the 60s, 70s, decided that they only could take up that challenge of weather forecasting when they put the forces together, both the scientific forces and the forces to have large enough supercomputers to deal with that. And this is how this organization was established, with the goal to do a 10-day forecast. At the time, there were distinguished scientists who thought that this is an impossible task. And the first model that the European Center ran in research mode at the time in the 70s took actually 12 days to calculate a 10-day forecast. The first operational forecast was delivered in 1979 on a supercomputer that was one of the most powerful, or most powerful at the time, a Cray 1, and it took 5 days to compute the forecast. We have come a long way. We are now producing operational forecasts twice a day, and some of them 4 times a day, within an hour. That's our production schedule. We have much more powerful computers, but we have as well improved the models over time. So maybe a bit about less about the organization, but how weather forecasting has improved. I spoke about the 5 hours for the forecast. The value of the forecast is not only to know whether you need an umbrella or not, or whether you can go to the beach or not. I think the impact that weather forecasting has on society is it actually saves lives and properties. One of the focus areas that we are working on is a reliable prediction of severe weather events with enough lead time. I'll give you one example of an event that happened in 1953. 1st of February, there was a big storm and a storm surge in the North Sea that coincided with the high tide, and it led to severe flooding on the British East Coast and in the Netherlands. It killed 3,100 people. 3 million people had to be rescued, and the authorities had 12 hours warning. There are I've looked at examples from Ireland. So there was the storm Desmond last year, December 2016, which brought a record amount of rain and a lot of flooding. Events like that can be forecast with days ahead, which gives actually emergency services then the lead times to take action, to deploy equipment, to prepare for that. And we plan to go in much more in that direction. ECMWF has recently launched its 10-year strategy. And one of the goals that we have is to improve the reliable prediction of severe weather events and such events in that 10-year time frame 2 weeks ahead, which is a very challenging goal. What we need for that is a lot of high-performance computing. The ways to improve forecasts are increasing resolution of the model. In the 70s, the model resolution was 210 kilometers. Today, our model has a 9-kilometer global resolution. Another area is the representation of the physical processes in your model. Again, a huge driver for computing capacity. And last but not least, observation data. We are getting observation data from all over the world, from in situ observations, buoys, aircraft, satellites. At the moment, we are ingesting 40 million observations a day into the system, but we use only a fraction of the observations that are available to us. Again, processing observations needs a lot of computing power. To make it worse or better, weather forecasting is now using ensemble prediction systems. So rather than doing one forecast, we do 50 forecasts with a slight perturbation in the initial conditions. And that gives us a measure of the uncertainty and probability of events happening. So you multiply your computing resources by a factor X. And we are moving more and more into Earth system modeling. So it's not only the dynamics of the atmosphere, physical processes, it's the chemistry of the atmosphere, it's the interaction with land, sea surface, ice, sea ice, increased complexity and huge challenges ahead for the use of supercomputing. So I don't know whether I have now answered your question.
Yeah, very comprehensive, and the takeaway is HPC saves lives, so it goes beyond competitiveness. I think that was a fantastic example, Isabella, that you shared. So to keep us going, I'll go to Mark. Obviously, you were at CERN. You're deeply involved in PRACE, leading UK implementation. I'm fascinated by what you're doing in exascale, and when I was at Intel, one of the things I was most proud of, we were able to land 80% of Intel's exascale research in Europe with the French Atomic Agency, with the Barcelona Supercomputing Centre, IMEC, and Leuven, and I think that was a tremendous accomplishment. But, while you're talking about HPC and competitiveness, can you see a future for exascale in Europe? Can Intel or Europe be a leader in exascale?
I think it's very. I mean, Roberto touched on this in his speech. I think we're at a very interesting moment in high-performance computing. So I had the cabinet secretary for the UK, a very, very senior civil servant, around our data center recently, and we showed him round, and I said to him, he kept saying to me all the way out in the car, surely we can just do all this in the cloud in the future. And I took him into our big data center. We've got a very big Cray full of Intel processors, you'll be pleased to hear. And I said, you mustn't think of that as a computer. That's a scientific instrument. It's like an astronomer pointing at a telescope. You won't be able to do some of the really big things we want to do in high-performance computing in the cloud, because you still need these scientific instruments that are very expensive, very tightly coupled, capable of doing vast numbers of calculations. But the problem we have in Europe, and actually all around the world, is we've reached a tipping point in all of this. A single member state, and I have to say I'm Scottish and European and rather ashamed to be British, a single European state cannot build an exascale system on its own. Even the Germans are now realizing this, even though they've put 500 million euros in the past 5 years into HPC. We're going to have to group together. We're going to have 1, 2, maximum 3 exascale systems in Europe. And in order to do that, we have to decide how we spend the taxpayers' money to do that. We need to be think really carefully about how we get most bang for our euro. And to do that, we need to look at how innovation works in the world today. If you look at Intel, Intel spends $11 billion annually on research and development. And the 7 top spenders on research and development in the world today spend the whole of Horizon 2020 funding annually. So that means that people like Roberto have a really difficult job working out how they target the limited resources we have to achieve what we want for Europe. And I would argue that member states need to get their act together, club together and build and buy these big systems. I don't particularly care where the technology comes from. I'd like some of it to be European, but we should also pick the best bits. But by clubbing together, we should also use the Commission to bring scientists together, to bring the best technologists together from both academia and industry to develop the software, the applications, and the things we want to do. And I think it's really, really crucial we get this right, and it's a really important moment in the history of high-performance computing, not just in Europe, in fact, but worldwide. And just throwing money at it like the Chinese are in particular, and to a lesser extent the Japanese and Americans, I don't think that's actually going to cut the mustard. I think we've got huge technological and software challenges coupled to money challenges and getting the general population to accept that this makes sense.
Great, Mark. You've made some really strong points. But I think we should say Horizon 2020 is actually the world's largest open innovation fund, and what you're suggesting in terms of 2 or 3 exascale systems where we can collaborate, we can compete with anybody. I've worked a lot with the US CTOs, and they look at envy. They seem to be powerless, to change the way the NSF operates. But when we pool together, we get alignment, we can accelerate, and we amplify our collective investment. So I think using the strength of community and Horizon 2020 in Europe, we absolutely can be at the table. So thanks, Mark. And last but not least, Leo, you have a strong track record in industry, now working with the IDA. I don't know if you've come across examples of HPC and competitiveness, but we're particularly interested in also when you're trying to attract a new company into Ireland, does Ireland's HPC capability come up either in terms of the largesse of the machine or actually the capability? And I think one of the things we often confuse HPC and supercomputing, and HPC is a broader paradigm. It's about programming for performance. So does that come up often, Leo?
Yeah, I think you put it in exactly the right way, Martin, as a question. So I think we've seen increasing demand. I started at IDA 3 years ago, and an old mentor of mine said to me, IDA is about jobs, and jobs happen in what's the current wave, the stuff that's really hot right now. I think when I joined, probably HPC wasn't yet there in terms of industry. I think it was coming very fast. You'd done a lot of groundwork at Intel, among others. But it's there now. We're starting to feel that it is the current wave. We're seeing lots of clients. You had some great examples there in the video from Intel and DDN. You guys were market leaders, in fairness to you both, on HPC, but we're seeing more and more people. So Mark's team, when they did their due diligence last year on Ireland for an AI lab, would have visited ICHEC as part of that tour. And just being able to tick the box that competence existed in Ireland. I hope Mark had made a difference for you guys. I know it was an important thing for us to have that capability available. I met a client last week with IoT World Europe was in Ireland last week, and we met a client that we've really struggled to gain traction with, a big European player, and one of their subsidiary businesses actually is satellite imaging. And with the work that JC and the team have been doing with ESA, there was a nice hook for a follow-up. So there was something to say, well, look, there is a HPC-related satellite imaging project and capability here in Ireland. So again, that was useful. I met Sufyan on the way in today, and actually just today, not because I was coming here, one of my team had said to me they had a really positive engagement yesterday in the area of image processing for animation and advanced graphics. So again, that was really interesting. It was one of our clients and an Irish company actually looking at collaborating together through the ICHEC vehicle. So having that tick the box of the capability is important. I think it's been important for a long time for specialists like Intel and DDN. I think it's becoming much more widely applicable, and I'm seeing that as a monthly change. We're seeing more and more people who are saying HPC is important to me. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, you called it out at the start, personalized medicine, those kinds of trends, Martin, are what's really driving the mass demand for HPC. I think back to the substance of your question, I think you put it as, is it out compute or is it use of HPC? I'd say it's much more on the use of HPC side, and I think you kind of guided me towards that answer, but it's what I feel strongly anyway. Ireland isn't going to be able to build an exascale computing platform that competes on a European basis. I think Mark put it very well. It's questionable whether there's a need for every country in Europe to have that. I think we need to have compute enough. The guys have had Fionn, so there needs to be enough compute that the people in ICHEC and the really great researchers we heard from earlier can maintain their competence, that we have the skills to bring to bear. But actually what the guys in ICHEC have done uniquely well and where I think we can really build on that strength and grow the capability is around the competence. If you can bring a GPU, whether you're NVIDIA or Intel or whichever of the GPU processing people or HPC systems or a problem in satellite imaging to a group and get better outcomes, as JC described, if you can take a compute problem down from 4 minutes to 1 second, that's the kind of verifiable stuff that industry needs to hear. So I think it is the use of HPC. We need to make sure there's compute enough that people can maintain their skills, and there's a huge appetite in industry.
Fantastic, Leo. I think Don Moore is here from the Academy of Engineering. I think we have a lot of great inputs already that could help shape a high-performance computing strategy for all of Ireland. We'll go to the floor in a second for some questions. Just Mark, could you summarise, because we're getting tight on time. What are the key trends that you're seeing in high-performance computing? And I know you might want to touch on quantum and.
So I gave a couple of examples about clouds and GPUs. I think what we're really looking at right now is quantum computing. And if you look at quantum computing, we believe that it could be like the next step for high performance computing. And I like very much, your remark, which is related to the fact that I think there is a massive investment that is done there. If you look at Microsoft, they've been investing for 10 years. Google obviously investing. And we're working with companies like D-Wave. I don't know if you heard about D-Wave in Vancouver. So they have those amazing computers. It's about $5 million a pop. So you better make sure that when you invest in those computers, you know exactly what you're going to do. Which is, I think, the key point is that leveraging those high-performance computing, quantum computing, and everything is great things. But I think the mindset needs to be about to build an ecosystem around it who's going to be using it, and coming up with a real business challenge or a social challenge. What do you want to do with it? Okay, it's all good to have all the technology and everything, but what do you want to do with it? What's important for this? So in the context of quantum computing in our labs, what we've been doing is that we've been talking to our clients. And we've been serving clients. And believe it or not, we've been able to identify 153 use cases that would be relevant for quantum computing. What could we do with quantum computing that could solve the world, that could change the way basically we live and work every day? And 153 use cases. So some of them are really interesting, like for example, detection of money laundering. Money laundering is everywhere. How are you going to stop that? And you're going to stop that very quickly because this transaction goes all over the place, We believe that quantum computing can help there. We're working with a biotech company, to work on comparison of very complex molecule, and for building basically or synthesizing drugs. Okay, I don't want to go back to the cancer because it's a very important topic for us, for the labs and personally. And I think that if you look at cancer today, the way it works is that we detect basically a cancer you have, the stage you have and everything. And normally, if it's tenders, you fill into some protocol, okay? And we're going to apply this protocol and we know exactly the chemotherapy you're going to go through, the radio and stuff like that. But very often, I mean, we find cancer that we don't know much about, you know, and you need to figure out what is the right chemotherapy that you need to put together. So it's a lot of chemical and chemistry work to be done there, and it's really running against the clock. If it takes like a month, basically, to figure out exactly the treatment that you need to go through to save you, it's too late. We believe that with quantum computing, we're going to be able to do this in an hour. And so right now, we're working also, I mean, I was talking about synthesizing new drugs, you know, I mean, the things that can be done, which is really interesting, is that there is the possibility to create new drugs based on existing drugs that exist. So you can just derive it. And the advantage of doing that is that you don't have to go through all the certification that you need, because this is very heavy, you know. So if you take drugs, basically, and you take a derivation of this, basically, to come up with another one, then it's going to be much faster. And instead of spending 10 years, basically, to do all the testing and everything, you can basically synthesize basically this drug in 1 year. But one thing that takes a lot of time is that it's from these initial molecules, how you're going to create new other molecules that's going to be able basically to be connected to the whole sequence of things that you're putting together. And this comparison right now is done at 2D level, because those molecules are very complex, and they're using high-performance computing. Even big computers, supercomputers doing this today, they're not fast enough. And we believe that, and we're testing that right now, that we could do that in 3 dimensions, and we could do that with quantum computing, and it would take instead of a few days, it would take like also, it could be split seconds and hours and stuff like that. So this is the things that we believe we're going to be able to do. So the approach that we're using here is that we're using a software as a service, okay? And we're building basically a platform, and we're leveraging a platform for a company called 1Qubit, which is, I think, also connection of this whole open innovation things. If you want to be successful, you need to collaborate. The way you need to collaborate, you need to basically integrate, I mean, startups, great brains, great people and everything, scientists from all over the world to help you basically to work out those challenges. So through open innovation organization that we have within our lab, we've been able to connect with startups called 1Qubit. And what do those guys, they're building an operating system on top of those quantum computer. And this operating system, this is not Windows 10. Forget about it. And this you're not gonna program in Fortran. Forget about it. What you need to have mathematicians, because it's all about talents. Also, you're gonna recruit basically to leverage basically the technology. And those guys, basically, what they're gonna do is they're gonna take your problem and represent that as a graph representation, because it's all about graph representation. And that's what you do. So the reason why I'm telling you all this is that because I think there's a couple of messages there. Number one is that it's a collaborative effort. Second thing is that you need to leverage an ecosystem. Third thing is that you need to have a business challenge mindset, something like a big challenge that you want to go after, and it's going to help you basically to solve something really big. And that's what's going to get basically all the energy and the enthusiasm to do this kind of work. I think that's the things that we're looking for right now.
Great, Mark, and clearly quantum computing is the future. I think it's a great example actually of a country that actually had a national HPC strategy is Holland, because they invested very heavily in it. And 5 years ago, you know, and when you'd be interviewed, the only country in the world, even in the US, HPC or quantum never came up, but in Holland, even the informed journalists were talking about quantum computing. And when I was at Intel, I was delighted. Intel's first investment in quantum computing was in Holland at the University of Delft, a 50 million 10-year agreement. And it was really hard for my American colleagues when they saw this investment going into Holland. So I think it's a proof point why we need a high-performance computing strategy for Ireland. So questions from the floor. Here, please state your name and please.
I guess I'd like to maybe ask a question from a slightly different angle. So I was the founding chair of the Price User Forum. So from a user perspective as an academic, which I am, one of the big issues is skills. So we can talk about the performance of supercomputers, but obviously supercomputers do not perform. It is the people who write the code that get them to perform. So we can create an ecosystem, as Price has done very successfully. We can create an ecosystem of hardware, but we need an underlying ecosystem of people. And that does involve, I mean, we talk about bringing in the scientists and the mathematicians and everything, but those scientists and mathematicians have to learn their trade somewhere. So at some point, we do need to acknowledge that money has to go into, whether it's the universities or other things, we need money to go into PhD students and so on in areas which use HPC so that these people can then go on into industry. And I mean, of course, we all know that and we all nod and everything, but it is something that does generally get lost in the discussion, because the biggest shortage for me as an individual is compute cycles. But really, on a global scale, the actual shortage is in skills. So I wonder whether people have a view on
Who'd
that.
like Mark?
I think that's a really good point. It's a very interesting point. And you know, if I look at EPCC, I've got 100 staff, and they come from all over Europe, very much like ICHEC, in fact, in terms of staff coming from all across Europe. But we run an MSc in high performance computing. We train 40 staff, 40 students a year in high performance computing. But because of the way modern international education works, in any given year, less than 10 of those are UK students. Sometimes it's one UK student. Sometimes it's maybe 10 European students. The rest are coming from overseas, from China, Asia, everywhere. I think we need to be training many, many more students in high-performance computing, in parallel computing in particular, because I think parallelism is pervasive from your iPhone all the way to your high-performance computer. It's the same problem, really. We're just not doing that. We're not getting it. And if you look over the last decade, I did a sum that if you look at all the students that have been trained in high-performance computing across Europe, it's probably less than 25,000 in a 10-year period. And yet 3 million people go to work in Europe in the morning calling themselves a programmer, right? These numbers are just completely incorrect. We massively need to increase the number of people that are getting these skills, because it's these skills that allow companies to innovate. You know, many of the companies we work with, like Rolls-Royce, down to little companies in Scotland that do engineering and whatever, are desperate for staff and skills, and they just can't hire staff. Politicians need to understand this much better, and I sometimes think, certainly in the UK, they don't understand it at all.
Well, it's fantastic that we have Orla Quinn here as a real, important decision maker, and you could potentially marry sort of high-performance computing as a service skills in Ireland, and then the ideal conditions we have for data centres. This potentially could be an area where Ireland could lead in the future when we join some dots. Okay, Dennis Jennings, who the first Irishman to be inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame. So this will be a really, really difficult question.
Thank you. I'm not going to, no, it's not a difficult question. It's actually a follow-up to Turlog's question. And it is to pick on that to say, where is the opportunity for Ireland? We're not going to be manufacturing exascale computers, maybe foreign direct investment, there'll be some assembled here. We're not going to be leading the performance improvements through software development. We'll be contributing to it. But the real advantage in Ireland is skills. And as the first chair of ICHEC, one of the things I focused on, and very proud I focused on, was that skills, that people were more important than the machines. So if no one else is addressing that opportunity, we should be addressing that opportunity. We should be investing through ICHEC in not only 10 people, but maybe 1,000 people who have HPC skills. Yeah. And let me give you a sort of dimension of the problem. The new General Data Protection Regulation is coming in. It is estimated that in the Netherlands alone, there'll be a requirement for 25,000 data protection officers. So in the whole technology, it has nothing to do with high-performance computing. It's just that the skills that are needed to address our modern world are missing. There aren't 25,000 data protection officers in the world, let alone in the Netherlands. There aren't the necessary 100,000 high-performance parallel computing specialists in the world, and we need to be part of solving that problem. That, in my mind, is where the opportunity. And that's a challenge for the state, for the universities to provide the basic education, but mainly for ICHEC, because it's a technology skills that people require. It's experience and skills that can only be developed by working in that sort of environment. So that's what I'd like people to think about high-performance computing, not as machines, not as software, but as people solving problems.
So it's about investing in human capital rather than physical. So Roberto, did you want to come in, or JC, and then Mark?
A few points. I mean, I certainly agree with Denis and Turlock about the need to have a very aggressive training education initiative at national level. But these scenarios that Martin highlighted, we can genuinely be leaders in the effective use of high-performance computing in the world. There's no reason why we couldn't, right? And we demonstrated that at our scale, ICHEC, small organization, small budget, less than 30 people, we can take on some of the big US national labs, we can take some of the big US banks, even the almighty Accenture, and win awards, right? We got better guys on a specific problem, right? And I'm confident we can scale up with level of excellence as long as we do not compromise on our value. But I think sometimes we feel, we're the small guy on the edge of Europe. Can we really compete? Yes, we can. We can, and we can do it very quickly. So the examples I had with NVIDIA, with Intel, within the year of getting started with that technology, we were way up there, right? So I think it is a message not to be shy about it. Right?
So I think there's actually a strong theme emerging actually for the All Ireland HPC strategy, really focus on skills, and I'd much rather see us collaborating with Accenture and actually growing the joint capability. So Mark, I know you wanted to come in.
No, I wanted to, I love the comment, I mean, related to how we bring the skills. I was in Bangalore last week, and I was on some events. There was a key event on IoT Next. So it basically explaining what's the next generation of IoT. And my topic was about artificial intelligence and IoT and how you combine the two together, because it makes very much sense. And again, a lot of data generated, a lot of high performance computing needed, and so forth. But then after the panel, we invited a lady, and she drives basically an organization, which is a woman who code. And we're talking about high performance computing, people that we need to grow, but I think it's technology skills that we need to grow. Women that needs to be programming, more women to be embracing those kind of careers and everything. And what she says was very interesting, and I'm going to explain you why I'm doing this a little bit round stuff. It's just, my view is not so much about finding the people that are going to learn the technology, is that incentivize the millennium generation, the young guys and everything, the smart people, to embrace high-performance computing curriculum. And why they're going to embrace it? Because you're going to give them a challenge. You're going to give them something to change the world. And how this lady, she's going to be able to graduate 10,000 new ladies in programming in the next 2 years. Why she did that, how she get them completely attracted with programming in C++, in JavaScript and everything, by giving them a project to change the world. Whether it was an application to build, whether it was a small program to do, something to change the world. And ladies that have been completely embracing that are like girls, 10 years old and everything, they start programming like crazy, they get completely excited about this. So maybe the mindset is that what can we do with high performance computing to change the world, and how we can present that to this millennium generation to get them attracted in the curriculum.
Maybe Sarah and Isabel, do you want to come in on that in terms of getting more girls into this industry?
Yeah, last year I was involved in Women in Innovation, and I was absolutely horrified at, to be honest, I never really looked into it. I just was in an award situation. I needed to be able to answer some questions, to be quite honest. But I was absolutely...
Tough problem to have, yeah.
Yeah, no. And, but I was absolutely horrified at the level of, even if you look at, say, computer science, the points needed in Ireland to get into computer science, I was actually amazed at how low they were relative to other courses. Now, I've got 4 daughters, and what I thought was really interesting was I started reading, it was a report, and the key decision on what a child studies in university, there's 2 decision makers. There's 2 people who make the children decide. One is the parent, okay, and the other, to a lesser extent, is the teacher. And I thought that was really interesting because it's the parents, and I think there's a huge job, and there is this, I think it's an amazing program, that Coder Dojo. Yeah, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but I think something like that is amazing, because I just think that really when it comes to technology, most of the time you're losing half the population because so many women. Now, it is changing, and don't get me wrong, the statistics are improving, but most of the women are going into Because I remember somebody saying that I struggled to come up with the name of a scientist or an engineer, a female. I struggled with it. I couldn't think of anybody who is famous that's a woman, you know? And I think that there's a huge educational issue to be done, because I do think we're losing 50% of the population. The other thing is that when it comes to women, and I'm not bringing a women thing in here, but children and flexibility in the workplace, and the amount of kind of academics that are being lost that are female through the way, 10% of professors are women, even though 50% is 50-50 doing PhDs. So there's something wrong there. And I think it's a lot to do with flexibility in the workplace and all those kind of factors. But I think that when you're looking at, you know, if you're talking about creating, you know, what I find unbelievable is that even as a company like us looking for people, it's just so difficult to get kind of programmers at the moment, and particularly data analytics. And, you know, it's very, very difficult. So I think there is a huge job. It's a national issue. But I think if you see, sorry, my last point on this is that if you see what they did with the Leaving Cert, this is very Irish because it's to do with Ireland, they gave extra points for maths if you studied maths, right? And there's been a huge intake in maths. And I think that something like that needs to be done for anybody in the audience is that you need to incentivize children. You know, you make the physics, biology, whatever they need, you know, you make that easier to get in or whatever. You know, we just need to be a bit clever on how we actually attract people in to the courses.
Or even better, we put computer science on the Leaving Cert curriculum, which would be even, you know, would be a step further. But you're certainly stepping forward, Sarah. You know, there is an absence of role models.
I mean, you're losing. Somebody was telling me that in a class of 60 people in computer science, I think there's probably less than 10% women. Yeah. Now, somebody might, but I think that goes against any other course in the university.
And even in the US, you know, there's been serious degradation over the last 20 years. It's, you know, continues to plummet. I know, Isabella, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I actually agree very much with what you said, Sarah. And I think it's important to get girls interested in science and technology. When you look at high-performance computing, that is a very male domain. There are very few women in that. And I wonder why that is. Maybe because people get interested in the technology and that kind of macho thing of biggest, fastest, what have you.
She keeps looking at me.
I know that you're married to a lady that is one of the few women in high-performance computing. And it's kind of, one knows each other worldwide because there are not that many. It reminds me, when I was working at Graz University of Technology, we had the problem in all the technical areas to attract women, and we set up a program where we went into schools and invited girls for days at the university, working in the labs with female professors or assistant professors or female students, to give them role models, to give them interesting challenges. And I think the important thing that you, I think, Mark, said is there have been studies on how they are general in kind of mathematics and sciences in schools, and you get interest from girls and women in a different way than for boys. Girls need to understand what you want to achieve, what the benefit of what you're doing is. So getting girls interested in kind of challenging problems, solving something which is important for society, be it climate change or what have you, medicine, making a difference is a good way, I think, to get girls interested. It's not the technology that is the entrance door. It's the the problem that we solve that makes an impact for society.
I think that's a fantastic point. I think it sort of emphasizes what you were saying, Mark. Now, I really want to respect people's time. We're 5 minutes over. Maybe we'll take a last question.
Thank you very much, Martin. My name is Ethna Harley. I'm the Director of Marketing for Accenture here in Ireland, and just maybe want to share some good news with everybody is that actually this night, next week, on the 7th of December, Accenture, in collaboration with the Royal Irish Academy, will be putting women on the walls of Academy House for the first time in its 230-year history. You may have noticed or may not have noticed that there are no men on the walls of this beautiful institution. It was something which myself and some colleagues noticed. We got an opportunity to collaborate with the Academy, and 4 portraits painted by the beautiful artist Vera Clute of the first 4 female members of the Academy have been painted and will be unveiled next week by the Taoiseach Francis Fitzgerald and 8 recipients of European Research Starter grants who all have wonderful stories to tell, all are holding objects of the various domains which they represent. And there's a lot of opportunity for some media coverage from some packs to go to schools, etc. So I think there is change coming, but we would appeal to everybody to engage with the programme, hashtag Women on Walls, and to be able to join us. And we would hope others would take our lead and do positive initiatives to make women leaders visible. Just thought that was relevant.
Great, fantastic. So I'm going to ask JC to close, but just to thank you all for coming. I know people like Kieran came from Cork, especially for the event, and Joe. Lots of people have given up their evening. I think we've actually had a fantastic discussion. The panel will be around afterwards for some questions. But can I ask you to thank Leo, Mark, Isabella, Roberto, JC, Mark, and Sarah? I think they did a fantastic job. And thank you to Pádraig and Laura and all the team at the Royal Irish Academy. What a fantastic venue, really fitting. So JC, I'm going to ask you to just close.
So very briefly, I would like to thank everyone for your time. I do appreciate you making the effort to participate. But please consider this meeting very much as a beginning rather than an end in itself. And I think we are resolutely determined to continue this discussion and to engage with all relevant stakeholders, not only in Ireland, but also, of course, across the EU, the Commission, and even beyond the EU, to try to formulate a more precise, maybe, approach or strategy, in fact, to help exploit this unique opportunity. For those of you who have a bit of time tomorrow morning, we're actually running a session, a half day, at the Institute of Chartered Accountants. You have a booklet with you of 10 stories, and we have 10 representatives from these organizations who will come in person to explain briefly their own experience of what HPC, the impact it had on their organization, and their own experience of engaging with ICHEC staff. So by any means, tomorrow morning, if you have time, you'll be very welcome. We have a free lunch as well. And for those of you who are users of the National Service, academics, we are holding a joint meeting of the Science and Users Council also, where we intend to provide a position paper regarding infrastructure funding needs for the academic community in Ireland for years to come. Again, thank you very much for your attention.
And congratulations.